One day after announcing a ceasefire agreement in Gaza, Israeli leaders say it is not yet a done deal. Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu, and this is The Heat. An Israeli cabinet vote on the pending ceasefire deal was delayed on Thursday as Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu accused Hamas of reneging on parts of the agreement. That vote is not expected now, at least until Friday. 15 months of Israeli bombing have left more than 46,000 Palestinians dead, according to Gaza officials. Shortly after the agreement was announced, Israel struck Gaza with more bombs, killing dozens more Palestinians, including 21 children. We begin with this report from Jonathan Regev in Tel Aviv.
It was on Wednesday evening, local Israeli time, when it seemed that the hostage deal was agreed upon in Qatar, and it was clear that it will be approved in Israel the following morning. But Thursday evening in Israel, and the agreement has not been approved yet. The cabinet, which was meant to convene on Thursday morning, did not convene, and so far there is no approval from Israel for the deal. There is an understanding that eventually it will happen. The American mediators are saying that all the points of contention that suddenly appeared on Thursday morning were resolved, and the Israeli cabinet will eventually meet and approve the deal, and so will the government, and it should go forward. But I think it shows the suspicion that exists between the two sides. Even after it seemed as if everything was agreed upon, there's still differences, and things are not finalized yet.
People felt that it took too long, and Israel-Hamas could get to a deal that would be even better than what we have now and conclude everything already 5 or 6 months ago. So it's a bit of frustration and sadness about people that died or were, their condition got worse for this period.
This is not the agreement that I wanted to see. It's an abandonment deal.
And of course, this delay in the meetings here in Israel could also mean a delay in the implementation. There's a process to happen here in Israel: approval by the cabinet, approval by the government, a certain window, usually 48 hours for appeals. If the Qatari mediators wanted everything to be over by Sunday around midday local time, things may be delayed. And as this is happening, there's already a political drama in Israel, as the Minister of National Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir, announced that he and his party will not be a part of a government that approves such a terrible deal. According to Ben-Gvir, the Jewish Power Party, headed by Ben-Gvir, does not have enough fingers to bring the government down altogether. But if they really withdraw from the coalition, then this coalition will have only a slim majority in parliament. Of course, any vote that regards the hostage deal will go through, due to the fact that the opposition already announced they will back any move regarding the opposition deal. But probably sometime during this upcoming weekend, we should have an answer as to which way Benjamin Netanyahu is going. Jonathan Regev, CGTN, Tel Aviv.
Right, to discuss the latest, let's bring in our guests. Joining us here in Washington, D.C., Dan Arbell is a scholar in residence at the Center for Israeli Studies at American University. Right here in the studio with us, Joel Rubin is a former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Legislative Affairs. From Virginia, we're joined by Trita Parsi. He is the Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and an expert on the geopolitics of the Middle East. And from Montreal, we're joined by Mouin Rabbani. He is a non-resident fellow at the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Mouin Rabbani, let me start with you. You know, when this announcement was made, this announcement of a ceasefire deal was made by President Biden and others, there was a great deal of relief among Palestinians and many others around the world that the violence will now stop. But then we heard from the Israeli government, from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, saying that This is not a done deal. It still has to be approved by the cabinet, and we know that there are hardliners in the Israeli cabinet. As our reporter just told us, one of them, Itamar Ben-Gvir, has said that he will not be part of this agreement. So what is your reading of where we are right now?
I don't believe that the Qatari Prime Minister would have made a public statement that this was a done deal unless he had assurances, both from the Israeli negotiators and from their chief allies in the United States, that it was indeed a done deal. I think what we're seeing now is a typical theatrics and drama engaged in by the Israeli leadership on the cusp of any agreement. And I find it exceptionally difficult to believe that this Israeli government will withhold its formal endorsement of this deal on the day that Donald Trump is being inaugurated as the president of the United States on the 20th of January. In other words, one day after implementation is supposed to begin. I think it's pure theater and nothing more.
Don Arbell, what is your view on this? I mean, when we hear the Prime Minister say that, look, it still has to be approved by the cabinet, it will get to a vote on Friday. I mean, is he, in this instance, talking to his domestic audience, many of whom are not happy with this deal?
Yeah, I think most of what we are seeing is Netanyahu trying to talk to his political base, his supporters, which many of them are not supportive of a deal or are apprehensive about a deal, and he's trying to keep his coalition together, and that's what's guided him for the last year and 3 months. You know, since the war broke out on October 7th, his main concern was, keeping this coalition together. And so right now, he's kind of juggling. He has all balls up in the air. After Biden announced it and Trump announced it and the Qatari Prime Minister announced it, he's the only one not to announce the deal. But he did not come out and state in his own voice that there are problems or that there are open issues or that the approval is pending.
Right.
And he's very careful not to do that, so not to upset Donald Trump. And that's his other consideration. So he's now kind of caught in between a rock and a hard place, between Trump on one hand and the zealots in his coalition on the other hand. And I think that at the end of the day, it may take another day or so, but I think that at the end of the day, he will have no other choice but to go to a cabinet meeting, to have the cabinet approve the deal, and win Knesset approval, as said, that the opposition supports him.
Dan, one other point, briefly, please, if you could tell us. Look, this was a similar deal that was on the table in May. That was, 9 months ago? But at that point, according to multiple reports, that deal was killed at the time by Prime Minister Netanyahu. So what's changed now?
So I think it's a convergence of several things. First of all, the war, 7 months have passed since then. The regional arena has changed dramatically with the elimination of Sinwar, the elimination of Hezbollah leadership, with the strikes on Iran, with the fall of Assad in Syria. All that has contributed to a kind of a sense of a different kind of region, and a sense that Israel has made quite a few advancements in the war. Second is, I think that there's a lot of the fact that the Biden team and the Trump team came together work on this certainly made an impact. And again, the participation of Donald Trump in this and his representatives certainly helped twist Netanyahu's arm and bring this, make this happen. I also think that Hamas was more inclined to support this, as they felt pressure and they wanted to show goodwill on one hand and achievements on the other hand.
Joel, as Dan said, in fact, President Biden said this as well. He said his outgoing administration, as well as the incoming administration, worked, as he put it, as one team to get to this point. This was a deal that was mediated by the United States, by Qatar, and by Egypt. If this was essentially the deal that was on the table 9 months ago, why didn't President Biden put pressure on the Israelis at that time to get it done?
Well, Anand, he did. And I think what's interesting about this, when we look at the domestic politics on the American side, is that Republicans attacked him for it. Let's talk real U.S. domestic politics. Everyone was attacking Joe Biden, frankly. Progressive critics were attacking him for not being hard enough. Republicans were attacking him for being too soft and not allowing Israel to hit Hamas even harder. And so there was a window and a gap. And I think for the Prime Minister, he saw that, and he saw time was on his side. He also had, as we're seeing, in these rifts in the right wing of his coalition, they are being exposed now for all to see that he has a chunk in his coalition that do not want any agreement. Ben-Gvir said, I will not be in this government, but if we return to fighting, I'll rejoin the government. So that's what Netanyahu was looking at. And I think when Donald Trump decided to support the Biden plan, as he did after the election, and unify the American position, that really gave the signal that this was the deal. This is the deal they had to take. There was no arm twisting from Donald Trump other than saying, get it done. There was no call for an aid cutoff or a demand for a unilateral ceasefire. There was just unity of voice, and that is when America is strongest. And I think that's why we're seeing movement now.
Ben-Gvir has threatened to withdraw from the government,
Yeah.
and as our reporter pointed out, he doesn't have a number of members that could lead to the collapse of the government. But if we have others who take the same view, could it lead to the collapse of the government?
Yeah, it could. There are 68 out of 120 members in the Netanyahu coalition. Ben-Gvir brings 6. So if he leaves, Netanyahu still has a majority. If more were to leave and Bezalel Smotrich, the other right-wing leader in his coalition government, that would collapse the government in theory. But then they would still have to decide on this deal. And Yair Lapid, the outside leader of the opposition, says he would support the government staying in power to get this deal across the line.
Trita, Parsi, you wrote a piece in which you said that President Biden could have secured a ceasefire by using America's vast leverage, but he chose not to. You also said that Biden was on board with Prime Minister Netanyahu's war plans. In fact, he sat in on that meeting when those war plans were being discussed. Tell us more about that. What led you to this belief?
Well, I think the evidence is absolutely clear. And if don't take it from me, take it from Biden's own ambassador to Israel, Jack Lew, who in an exit interview said at no point did the Biden administration tell the Israelis just to stop the war. So the idea that there actually was some real pressure on Netanyahu at any point during the Biden term, I think is refuted by his own administration. And we also saw how diplomats were being quoted that the only real big change this time around was that for the first time, there actually was some real pressure on the Netanyahu government. I think the idea, I mean, my good friend Joe makes a good point about when the US is united, clearly it does have more leverage. But I think in this specific case, unity with a lame duck Biden government doesn't make much of a difference. I think most of this is because of the fact that Biden proved himself to be quite okay with Netanyahu running all over him. But Netanyahu has a very different relationship with Trump. Trump has a very different type of a persona and probably would not tolerate anything like that. And as a result, I think Trump is much more careful about crossing Trump compared to what he was with Biden, for which he didn't seem to have much respect at all.
Joel, you want to say something?
Yeah, to build on what Trita is saying, people are assuming that somehow Netanyahu and Trump have a great relationship. Well, they really don't. They didn't end on a high note. Prime Minister Netanyahu congratulated President Biden when he was elected, much to the consternation of Donald Trump. It really aggravated him. And also when the United States attacked and killed Qasem Soleimani, apparently Israel was supposed to be in on that and then pulled back. So there are a lot of tensions there. And I think that the Prime Minister understands that Donald Trump is very popular in Israel. And Donald Trump has political power there over Netanyahu that could put him in a very weak position domestically. So that's what he has to really worry about.
Mouin, Rabbani, getting back to the deal itself, it will be implemented in 3 phases. That is, if the Israeli cabinet approves this deal, we don't know that yet. Phase 1, as we heard, will start on Sunday. So what are the nuts and bolts of that part of the deal? And, it might stop the bombing, but what about the fact that nothing in this agreement, what we've seen so far, actually addresses the root causes?
Yes, this is not a peace agreement. This is not a deal to address the underlying political crisis that is now in its 8th decade. This is an agreement that encompasses a gradual ceasefire leading to an indefinite long-term cessation of hostilities and a comprehensive exchange of captives and hostages. The there are two main obstacles here. The first is that it is a phased deal. In other words, it consists of 3 stages, and there is every possibility that it will be that the second or subsequently the third stage won't be implemented, and that would mean we go back to where we are. And the second and potentially more important landmine is that the second and third stages of this agreement are still being negotiated and still need to be finalized. And so there's every reason to believe, particularly given Netanyahu's political and coalition problems that we've discussed, that he will endorse the agreement, and then 42 days from Sunday, at the end of the first stage, when perhaps Washington no longer cares as much about what's happening in the Middle East because the inauguration is passed off without a hitch, that he will then withdraw from the second stage and return to the military campaign in the Gaza Strip. There's a belief that that's going to be very difficult for him because of the political pressure, the public pressure that will be generated within Israel to complete this deal, because a number of captives and hostages will not be released until the second or third stage. But I suspect that to assume that this is a deal that's going to lift itself up by its bootstraps, is a very risky assumption.
All right, those concerns that you talk about on the implementation of the second and third phases, they have been raised, and the Qatari Prime Minister said, look, there is something in the agreement called the follow-up mechanism, which will address those concerns if one or the other side violates the terms of the agreement. Is that enough of a safety mechanism, do you think, for this to be implemented?
I'm sorry, was that question to me?
Yes, it was. Yes, it was, Mouin. Yeah. Have we lost Mouin? Mouin, can you hear me? Okay, let me move on to Dan Arbell. Dan Arbell, there was a piece in the Associated Press looking at what the Israelis want out of this. Israel is insisting on controlling the movement of Palestinians in the north of Gaza, maintaining military control over the Netzarim corridor. That's the corridor that effectively separates north and south Gaza. It also wants control over the Philadelphia corridor, which is right on the border, and it covers the Rafah border crossing as well. And it wants to continue the ban on UNRWA, that's the United Nations Relief Agency, and it wants to cut all ties with that agency. So what is the broad Israeli goal here?
So, look, all these points that you mentioned have been mentioned, but there is a solution for every one of them. They're talking about, once the ceasefire is in place, we expect hundreds of thousands of Palestinians to go back to northern Gaza, and those who will be walking on foot will be admitted without any monitoring or vetting, and those not entering in other ways will be vetted by a U.S. security company. As for Philadelphia corridor, Israel will not remain in the Philadelphia corridor in its entirety, but kind of reposition its troops along parts of the Philadelphia corridor with the aim at a certain point of fully withdrawing from the Philadelphia corridor. And so these issues are and then as for UNRWA, I've read reports that the US and Israel are discussing ways of of creating or endorsing an UNRWA 2.0 kind of mechanism, similar to UNRWA, but maybe under a different name and a different mission perhaps, but with basically leaning on the infrastructure that UNRWA has on the ground. So all these are issues that are being discussed, and I think that practical solutions can be found for all of them.
Joel, as we heard, this is not a peace treaty of any kind or anything formal like that. It is an agreement. It depends on the good faith on both sides to implement this agreement. So, can it be really enforced? Is there any mechanism to enforce it?
Well, in the Middle East, there's really no unicorn type of agreement that we can look to as an example that it completely ended all hostilities except for the Israel-Egypt Camp David Accords, for example, that took many years to negotiate and built on multiple stages of diplomatic agreements over a near decade. But I think what we're looking at here is a 6-week period that has mechanisms built into it that provide incentives for both sides to behave well. The release of hostages is set up so that every week there's a new release. The same in regards to Palestinian prisoners, every week. So what is happening is you're going to be seeing the building up of public support for this agreement by the continued release. That's the idea. And of course, then during this 6-week period, they will continue to negotiate for a longer ceasefire, and this ceasefire extends if the negotiations continue. The big X factor that I'm worried about, of course, though, is from the American perspective, we're not going to have our diplomats in anymore that we've just had for the last several years. It's going to be Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, Steve Witkoff, the point person, and then a variety of new people. And many of the career people, it looks like they're not necessarily happy about in the Trump team. So what will the American points be? Who will be leading it? This means then, and I'll close with this, that the regional players, Egypt and Qatar in particular, who were there throughout these negotiations, are going to be very important to ensuring that all sides continue to maintain it as they negotiate further.
Right. Trita, Parsi, looking at how this agreement is going to be implemented, there was a piece written by the journalist Chris Hedges, and he's had wide experience covering the Middle East. He says that Israel is playing a cynical game. He says it makes phased agreements with the Palestinians that ensures that it gets what it wants. It then violates every subsequent phase and reignites its military assault. Is that the scenario that we're looking at?
It very well could be, and I think there's plenty of examples in the past in which things have played out the way that Chris lays it out in his article. But I think really the question is, once we have a ceasefire, and as everyone has said, this is not a peace deal, will there be movement towards trying to address the root causes? Trump has indicated that he's going to try to use this in order to further integrate Israel into the region. Now, the question then is, how does that look? Because if it's going to look the way it did when he was doing the Abraham Accords, which was essentially massive American concessions to Arab states for them to normalize relations with Israel and completely set aside the Palestinian issue. If that's the path Trump goes down, then we're going to see further violence, because there is a link between the Abraham Accord and the effort to completely make the Palestinians irrelevant and the atrocities that happened on October 7th. If that's the path he goes down again, then we're going to miss a major opportunity in which the entire international community, particularly given the resolution that was passed in the UNGA in September, is saying that we absolutely need to have a Palestinian state within a year in order to truly be able to resolve this issue and not constantly have to go back to it, not constantly have to see the images of people suffering on both sides.
Mouin, Rabbani, what are your thoughts on what happens after this agreement is implemented? I mean, all 3 stages of it are implemented. I mean, do you see Israel continue to control Gaza, in fact, take over the territory, or do you see a situation where perhaps the Palestinian Authority might be brought in to do that job? And do you see negotiations continuing after this agreement for perhaps a more permanent settlement?
Well, I really think all of that is up in the air now. And just building on what Trita Parsi just said, one of the guests earlier said that Qatar and Egypt will be key players in the subsequent phase. I would look just as closely at Saudi Arabia, because Riyadh is very much in incoming President Trump's sights in the context of further Arab-Israeli normalization. And I think a key issue now will be how Saudi Arabia and potentially other Arab states push this issue in Washington. Will they simply treat it once again as a bilateral deal with the United States in which the Palestinians get further marginalized? Or will they have learned the lesson of the past 2 years and say, well, we're prepared to move forward with this, but it absolutely has to address the root cause of the question of Palestine as well. I don't have a clear answer to that. I suspect we'll know more before the end of the year, but much of it very much depends, I think, not only on Washington, but also on the position taken by key Arab states. They've, of course, been completely inert for the past 15 months, so there's certainly reason for pessimism. But I think, if Washington, once having achieved quiet, makes a genuine effort to sustain that quiet and to address the underlying political issues, then there are other possibilities, although, of course, skepticism is entirely warranted.
Right, Joel, do you think there will be an expansion of the Abraham Accords, particularly with regard to Saudi Arabia and Saudi Arabia establishing diplomatic relations with Israel? Because, there was a lot of speculation after October 7th, 2023, when Hamas attacked Israel, that attack was motivated in major part to undermine any kind of relationship developing between Saudi Arabia and Israel. So where do you see it go to from here? I mean, and the Saudis have already said a number of times that they will not even consider a relationship unless there are serious talks on a two-state solution.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, look, for President Trump, the Abraham Accords is a legacy issue. It's one that he's very proud of. He speaks to. He wants Saudi Arabia in that. Israel wants a Saudi Arabia agreement bilaterally between them. It really is the question of the moment. Will the Saudis hold out and demand that there be a process for a two-state solution, if not an outright outcome that leads to that, in order to normalize with Israel? One other X factor that we need to pay attention to as well is the role of Iran. Will Iran try to push for spoiling this deal as well? Nobody really knows, although certainly the Iranian government just today put out some statements saying this is a victory for the resistance. So that doesn't bode very well. And I think that also is going to be a big factor for the Trump policy as they try to maneuver in getting Saudi Arabia into the fold with Israel and the United States closer, and as they work to isolate Iran, which I think is a high priority for the Trump team.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.